There's a certain feeling to a new piece of clothing, one that's hard to describe but impossible to forget. Perhaps it's the weight of the fabric, how it brushes against your skin for the first time, the slight crinkle of fresh seams. Maybe it's the way the light falls on it, soft, warm, inviting, or the gentle hum of a radio in the background as you prepare for the day. It doesn't even need to be anything extravagant, just something simple, like a jacket or a dress that makes you feel like someone different. Something about it feels just right, like the beginning of something new. Fashion in the 60s wasn't just about clothes. It was about self-expression, about telling the world who you were without saying a word. What was the one piece of clothing that made you feel like a different person? It wasn't anything elaborate, just a simple dress that caught the eye. But when you put it on, you felt it, a new kind of freedom. The lines were sharp, the cut clean and bold, the A-line silhouette that stood out like a breath of fresh air against the fabric of the past. It was the mod style that took over in the early 60s, a break from the longer, more modest dresses of the 50s. The vibrant colors, the geometric patterns, the way the dress moved as you did, all of it seemed like an invitation to something bigger. For women, dresses like these became more than just clothes. They were a symbol of change, of newfound freedom, and of a world that was starting to shift its view on what it meant to be a woman. Looking back, it seems almost ordinary now, doesn't it? A dress, something we take for granted, but in those moments, slipping into a mod dress, everything felt different. The world felt different. The fabric of the dress, soft yet structured, held a sense of rebellion, even if you didn't quite realize it at the time. There was something about the boldness of the design that made you feel bold too. The colors weren't just colors, they were statements. The cuts weren't just fashion choices, they were declarations of autonomy. For women in the 60s, clothing began to mean more. It wasn't simply about covering up. It was about becoming, about showing the world who you were in ways that weren't defined by anyone else's rules. Dresses like these didn't just change what people wore. They changed how they thought about themselves. For the first time, a woman could step out of the house and feel a little freer, a little more herself, just by wearing a dress. Something so simple, yet it carried so much meaning. The mod movement wasn't just about a new look, it was a new way of thinking. It wasn't about fitting in with a past generation's ideals, but about breaking free and embracing a future of possibility. At the time, it felt ordinary, but looking back, we see it wasn't. The simple dress represented a quiet revolution, one that made its way from the streets to the mainstream and changed how women dressed forever. There was a time when the thought of a woman in trousers seemed so out of place, almost foreign. Yet, in the 1960s, that quiet rebellion became louder, with trousers not just appearing on the streets, but becoming a symbol of change and defiance. The first time a woman wore trousers, it felt like a small victory. The crisp fabric against the skin was different than the softness of skirts or dresses. It held a weight, a sense of seriousness that few realized was a part of the quiet revolution happening in fashion. And it wasn't just about comfort. Trousers represented something deeper, a shift in how women saw themselves, how they moved through the world, and how the world saw them. For women, the act of wearing trousers was both a subtle act of rebellion and an assertion of freedom. Up until this point, women's fashion had been defined by restrictive silhouettes, skirts that limited movement, corsets that shaped the body to a certain ideal, and dresses that demanded poise and grace above all else. But trousers offered something different. They were practical, they were bold, and they were a statement. They said, "I am moving with the times." And for many women, that felt revolutionary. When trousers started to gain popularity among women, it wasn't just a matter of practicality. Yes, trousers were comfortable, but they also signified something more profound. They were a departure from the past. Before the 60s, the idea of a woman wearing pants was something that carried heavy social connotations. It wasn't just a clothing choice, it was an act of defiance. Trousers represented freedom, freedom from social expectations, freedom to express oneself in a new way, and, for many, freedom from the constraints of traditional gender roles. For some women, the shift to trousers felt both empowering and terrifying. There was a sense of exhilaration when stepping into a pair of pants for the first time, especially when it wasn't the norm. Women in trousers weren't simply adapting to a trend. They were claiming a new kind of independence. It wasn't just about looking different. It was about feeling different. Wearing trousers was a way to say, I am not bound by outdated norms. I will dress how I feel, and that is my choice. But the change didn't come without its challenges. In many places, it took years for trousers to become widely accepted. Women still faced judgment and criticism for choosing pants over skirts. Yet, these very criticisms only reinforced the power of wearing trousers. They became more than just a fashion statement. They were a battleground, a place where women could challenge the status quo. Each pair of trousers worn was an act of resistance, a quiet refusal to be held back by societal expectations. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine a time when trousers for women were seen as controversial. They've become so commonplace that it's difficult to recall the once rigid norms that dictated how women were supposed to dress. But in the 1960s, trousers weren't just a new piece of clothing. They were a statement that changed the course of fashion history, allowing women to embrace a new way of dressing, and ultimately, a new way of living. The simple act of wearing trousers wasn't just about comfort or convenience. It was about reshaping the narrative around what it meant to be a woman in the modern world. And in that small shift, everything changed. It's hard to imagine now, but before the Beatles, men's fashion was largely defined by tradition: stiff suits, polished shoes, and conservative cuts. The rules were clear, and the look was formal, often disconnected from the emerging sense of freedom that the 1960s were beginning to embrace. Then came the Beatles. Their arrival wasn't just a musical revolution, it was a fashion revolution too. They introduced a new way of dressing that broke away from the rigidity of the past and became a blueprint for modern men's style. For the first time, men's fashion felt fresh, youthful, and undeniably cool. When the Beatles stepped onto the world stage, they weren't just wearing suits, they were wearing modern suits. There was something about their slim, tailored cuts and clean lines that felt alive, something completely different from the stuffy, oversized suits of previous decades. The colors were more vibrant, the fits were sleeker, and their whole appearance radiated energy. It wasn't just about the clothing, it was about the attitude that came with it. Their suits, often paired with neat ties and perfectly combed hair, radiated a sharpness that was simultaneously fresh and timeless. They looked like the future, and the world couldn't help but take notice. For men, fashion in the 60s had long been a game of fitting in. Suits were a staple, but they were worn out of obligation rather than choice. Then came the Beatles, turning the suit into something that expressed personality rather than masked it. Their style didn't scream for attention, but rather invited it. They were not wearing clothes to fit in. They wore clothes to stand out, to celebrate individuality. The suits they wore, while similar to what other men were wearing, carried an entirely new energy. It was as if the suit had been modernized, made to feel less like an obligation, and more like an opportunity to showcase who you were. The Beatles didn't just redefine the suit, they introduced a whole new vocabulary of style for men. The mop-top haircut became as iconic as their music. It was a statement in itself, a rejection of the slicked-back, controlled hairstyles that had come before it. Their hair was soft, natural, and effortlessly stylish, reflecting the same sense of freedom and energy that their music embodied. It was a look that said, "We are the new generation, and we do things differently." They weren't just leading a cultural revolution through their music. They were doing it through their appearance too. The Beatles' influence went beyond just the suits and haircuts. It extended to the way men started to see themselves in relation to their clothing. For the first time in years, men could look to their clothes not just as a means of fitting into society, but as a way of expressing who they were. Men's fashion was no longer about blending in. It was about standing out, making a statement, and feeling free to be yourself. In retrospect, it's easy to see the transformative power the Beatles had on men's style. They didn't just change the way men dressed, they changed the way men thought about clothing. Their appearance, combined with their message of peace and love, redefined the concept of masculinity and fashion for a new generation. The world that had once demanded conformity was suddenly opening up to a new, exciting idea of what it meant to be a man in the modern world. And in the midst of it all, the Beatles proved that a suit could be more than just something you wore. It could be a reflection of who you were, a personal statement that carried both meaning and style. If the 1960s were about embracing freedom, the hippie movement was its loudest, most colorful expression. But even within the exuberance of tie-dye shirts and bell-bottom jeans, there was a quieter revolution at play: the power of clothing as a form of personal expression. While the fashion world had long been shaped by designers and industry standards, the hippies brought something entirely different to the table, a philosophy that didn't just reject the norms of society, but reimagined what clothing could be. For the first time, fashion became not just a way to look good, but a way to reflect one's ideals, one's freedom, and one's connection to something larger than just oneself. The texture of the clothes said it all: soft, worn-in denim, faded cotton, and earthy leather. They felt like they had a story, like they were touched by time. There was something liberating about the way a patched-up jacket or a flowing skirt could be worn with such confidence. These weren't clothes that shouted. They whispered, gently encouraging you to embrace who you truly were, free from the constraints of modern fashion or societal expectations. For the first time in a long time, clothes weren't about being polished or refined. They were about being real, about being grounded, and about being you. And there was a profound sense of ease in this new approach to dressing. The stiff collars, the pressed suits, the heavy fabrics of the 1950s had all been replaced by something that allowed for movement, for comfort, for individuality. The hippie movement encouraged people to wear what felt right for them, not what was dictated by the mainstream. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about impressing yourself, feeling good in your own skin. The flow of a dress, the easy fit of trousers, the simple beauty of natural fibers, all had a certain rhythm to them, a calmness that reflected a broader movement towards inner peace and acceptance. For many, this shift in fashion was also a quiet form of protest. The very act of wearing clothes that were homemade, that were hand-dyed, or that had been sourced from thrift shops was a rejection of the consumer-driven culture that was gaining ground in the 60s. Instead of chasing after new shiny things, hippie fashion celebrated what was old, what was secondhand, and what was meaningful. It was a return to simplicity, to authenticity, and to sustainability, values that felt all the more poignant as the world around them seemed to race ahead in a blur of technological and industrial progress. Hippie fashion wasn't just about rejecting the past. It was about creating something entirely new, a style that was both a reflection of the times and a way to challenge them. With their flowing dresses, fringed vests, and hand-woven accessories, the hippies embraced a vibrant and eclectic style that celebrated color, texture, and freedom. It was clothing that told a story, not just of rebellion, but of hope, of peace, and of a better world. What made the hippie movement so quietly powerful was how it spread without ever forcing itself into the spotlight. While it may have started as an underground movement, its influence was undeniable. The iconic look, from the long, flowing hair to the embroidered garments, slowly seeped into mainstream culture until it was no longer seen as radical, but as a natural evolution of style. There was a profound sense of unity in this fashion revolution, a belief that what you wore could align with your values and beliefs, something that gave meaning to your clothing far beyond the fabric itself. Looking back, it's clear that the hippie movement didn't just change fashion, it changed the way we thought about clothing altogether. It made us rethink the relationship between style and identity, between personal expression and societal norms. Clothes became more than just something to wear. They became a way to reflect your inner self, your connection to the world around you, and your commitment to living authentically. In the end, the quiet revolution of hippie fashion was about finding peace within and a reflection of that peace on the outside. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was real, and it was enduring. Before the 1960s, fashion was often a study in muted tones and simple designs. The prevailing palette was one of earth tones, pastels, and dark, serious colors. Black, gray, navy, and beige dominated wardrobes, with clothing often designed to conform to certain ideals of modesty and restraint. But in the 1960s, everything changed. Fashion became a visual explosion of color, pattern, and personality. The world suddenly felt more vibrant, more daring, and the clothes we wore reflected this bold new attitude. For the first time, clothes weren't just about blending in. They were about standing out, making a statement, and expressing individuality. One of the most iconic shifts in fashion during this time was the rise of bold patterns. Suddenly, clothes weren't just designed to fit the body. They were designed to capture the spirit of the moment. Geometric prints, swirling psychedelic patterns, and floral designs flourished in the wardrobes of young people everywhere. The simple act of wearing a brightly colored dress or a patterned shirt became a declaration of freedom. The clothes you wore were no longer just about style, they were about attitude. And this wasn't just about bright, bold patterns either. It was about using color to communicate something deeper, a sense of optimism, of joy, of rejecting the conformity of the past in favor of a more playful, vibrant future. The sensation of wearing these clothes was unlike anything people had experienced before. It wasn't just about how you looked, it was about how you felt when you wore them. The bright oranges, yellows, and reds of the mod dresses, the lush floral patterns of skirts, the geometric prints of shirts and jackets. They weren't just fabrics, they were energy. The fabrics themselves felt lively, almost electric, as if they were caught in a constant state of motion. Each piece of clothing wasn't just a garment, it was a reflection of the wearer's personality, a way to project their individuality to the world. Perhaps the most significant part of this shift was how it connected fashion with youth culture. For young people especially, this was a time of exploration and self-expression. The rise of the counterculture, the growing influence of rock and roll, and the societal shifts that came with them all found their way into fashion. Suddenly, it wasn't about wearing what was expected of you. It was about wearing what felt right, what felt alive. The patterns and colors weren't just popular because they were trendy. They were popular because they represented something deeper. They were about saying, I am here, I am present, and I am part of something bigger. At the time, the clothing felt revolutionary. The bolder, the better. But now, we see how it was the beginning of a shift in how we view fashion. Fashion wasn't just about mimicking the past anymore. It was about creating something entirely new. And in that creation, there was something profoundly liberating. By embracing patterns and colors, people weren't just embracing new trends. They were embracing a new way of thinking, a new way of being. Fashion had become a symbol of optimism, of living in the present, and of rejecting the muted, subdued world that had come before. As the 60s wore on, the world became a more colorful place. The streets were no longer filled with gray suits and dresses that blended in with the background. Instead, they were filled with people dressed in vibrant hues, loud patterns, and experimental styles. The clothing of the 60s wasn't just about looking different, it was about feeling different. And for those who embraced it, fashion became a form of personal freedom, an opportunity to reflect the inner vibrancy and optimism that came with a world on the verge of profound change. Looking back, it's easy to see how the birth of color and pattern in fashion wasn't just a superficial trend. It was a shift in how we viewed the world, how we interacted with it, and how we expressed ourselves. Color and pattern weren't just aesthetic choices. They were reflections of the times, of youth, of change, and of a new way of thinking. It was a fashion revolution that changed the way we dressed, but also the way we lived and the way we saw the world around us. The arrival of the mini skirt in the 1960s was nothing short of seismic. It wasn't just a fashion trend. It was a bold declaration, an expression of independence, and a radical departure from the norm. Before the mini skirt, women's fashion was defined by long skirts, full dresses, and modesty. The idea of showing more skin was not just unheard of, it was almost scandalous. But when designer Mary Quant introduced the miniskirt in 1965, the world of fashion was changed forever. What was once considered shocking soon became a symbol of freedom, confidence, and youthful rebellion. The first time a woman stepped out in a mini skirt, it felt like stepping into the future. The fabric brushed against the skin in a way that felt both daring and liberating. The legs, once hidden away beneath layers of fabric, were now exposed to the world, catching the light and inviting attention. It wasn't just a change in length, it was a change in attitude. The mini skirt was about embracing youth, energy, and confidence. It was a direct challenge to the rigid standards of the past, a way for women to reclaim their bodies and their space in a society that had long told them how they should look. The mini skirt also represented a fundamental shift in the role of women in society. For many, it was a symbol of empowerment. No longer confined to the draped and restrained styles of the past, women could now wear something that was modern, bold, and unapologetic. The miniskirt was a statement of autonomy, of choosing to dress for oneself rather than for the approval of others. It was about feeling free, both in body and spirit. The sheer simplicity of the skirt made it powerful. It wasn't trying to conform or blend in with the world around it. It was there to stand out, to make an impression. But the mini skirt wasn't just a symbol of personal empowerment. It was also a cultural statement. The 1960s were a time of profound social change, with movements for civil rights, gender equality, and personal freedom sweeping across the globe. The mini skirt became one of the defining fashion items of the counterculture, a tangible expression of the growing desire to break free from tradition and embrace new possibilities. In the same way that music, art, and politics were undergoing radical transformations, fashion was following suit. The mini skirt was an outward reflection of this inner shift in societal attitudes, a visual marker of a world that was opening up and daring to embrace the future. For women, the mini skirt offered a new sense of possibility. It was a garment that made a statement without saying a word, a garment that gave them the freedom to move and live in ways that had been unimaginable just a decade before. Wearing a mini skirt wasn't just about showing off legs. It was about showing off a new kind of freedom, one that could not be ignored. It represented a world where women could own their sexuality, their confidence, and their independence. It was a rebellion, yes, but a quiet, graceful rebellion that made its way into the hearts of millions. In the years since its rise, the miniskirt has become a timeless symbol of the 60s, a fashion item that continues to evoke nostalgia and admiration. What was once a radical act of defiance has now become a staple of modern wardrobes, worn by people of all ages and walks of life. But its significance remains the same, a reminder of the power of clothing to reflect and shape the culture around it. The miniskirt wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was a movement, a moment in time that encapsulated the energy, the spirit, and the hope of a generation eager to rewrite the rules. Looking back, it's clear that the miniskirt was more than just a fashion trend. It was a cultural revolution. It was about more than just exposing legs. It was about exposing new possibilities, new ways of thinking, and new ways of being. The miniskirt represented freedom, confidence, and a refusal to be held back by the expectations of the past. It was a garment that said, "We are here, and we are going to live life on our own terms." And in that, it forever changed the way we thought about women's fashion and the way we thought about ourselves. The 1960s were not just a time of political and social upheaval, they were also a time of personal awakening and rebellion. For many, the act of dressing became more than just a routine. It became a form of protest, a way to reject the status quo and embrace a new way of thinking about oneself and the world. Fashion, once dictated by social norms and expectations, was now being used as a tool to express individuality, to make a statement, and to challenge the conventions that had long confined people, especially women, to certain roles. This rebellion didn't need to be loud or extravagant. It was quiet, subtle, and personal. The simple act of wearing clothes that didn't conform to traditional standards was in itself a revolutionary act. For women, this was especially true. After decades of being told how they should look, what they should wear, and how they should present themselves to the world, the 1960s marked a shift in the way women viewed their clothing. Fashion was no longer just about looking proper or acceptable. It became about choosing to wear what felt right, what represented you, without apology or compromise. For many young women, this rebellion began with the miniskirt, but it didn't end there. Women began to experiment with their wardrobes in ways that were previously unthinkable. They chose pants over skirts, loose-fitting clothes over tight, form-fitted ones, and bold patterns over muted tones. These weren't just choices about style. They were choices about freedom, about rejecting the ideals that had been imposed on them, and about reclaiming their right to dress as they pleased. Fashion became a way to say, "I don't have to fit into your box. I can create my own box or live outside of it altogether." But rebellion in fashion wasn't limited to women. Men, too, began to reject the stiff, formal clothing that had long been associated with adulthood and responsibility. The conservative suits of the previous decades were replaced with looser, more relaxed styles that reflected the new cultural climate. The influence of rock and roll was everywhere, and it showed in the clothing choices of young men who no longer wanted to conform to the business-like appearance of their fathers. Tight pants, patterned shirts, and even more flamboyant choices, like brightly colored suits or peace symbols on jackets, became part of the movement. The goal wasn't necessarily to be fashionable in the conventional sense. It was to be free, to be unapologetic, and to define yourself by your own terms, not society's. The sense of personal rebellion extended beyond just the clothes. It was about the attitude behind the clothes. Fashion, in this context, was more than a surface-level appearance. It was a reflection of an inner transformation. It was about owning who you were, no matter how unconventional or out of place you might feel. The clothes you wore weren't just to cover your body. They were a form of armor, a way to protect your individuality and assert your right to exist outside the expectations of society. This personal rebellion in fashion was also deeply connected to the growing sense of political activism and the desire for social change. Just as people were beginning to demand civil rights, gender equality, and an end to war, they were also demanding the right to express themselves freely through their clothing. It wasn't enough to simply reject the norms of the past. People wanted to create a new vision for the future, one where personal expression was encouraged and celebrated. As the decade wore on, the notion of rebellion through fashion became more mainstream, but its roots remained in the desire for self-expression and individualism. Fashion was no longer something dictated by rules or trends. It became a tool for self-discovery and personal empowerment. What you wore became an extension of who you were or who you were becoming. The simple act of choosing to dress differently was a powerful reminder that fashion, like everything else, could be a form of resistance. Looking back, it's clear that the 1960s were a turning point in how we view fashion. No longer was it about conforming or fitting in. Fashion became about defying expectations, about embracing personal identity, and about challenging the limitations that had been placed on individuals by society. It wasn't about following trends. It was about creating your own, and in doing so, reshaping the very notion of what it meant to dress, to express, and to be free. Through fashion, the 1960s taught us that the clothes we wear are not just a reflection of our outer selves. They are a reflection of our inner rebellion, our desire to live authentically, and our commitment to change. When we look back on the 1960s, it's impossible to separate the fashion from the culture of the time. The era wasn't just defined by the clothing that was worn, it was defined by the cultural, social, and political movements that shaped those clothes. The revolution of fashion in the 60s was one of the most transformative moments in modern history, not just because of the bold choices it encouraged, but because of the enduring shifts it inspired in how we view self-expression, personal freedom, and identity. The styles that emerged during this decade, from the mod dresses to the flowing hippie garments, were more than just trends. They were symbols of broader societal changes. The mini skirt, the bell-bottom jeans, the patterned shirts. All of these pieces represented a new way of thinking, a new approach to life. They were the outward manifestation of a generation that was questioning old norms, fighting for equality, and demanding change. For many, fashion became a tool for self-expression, an opportunity to communicate beliefs, feelings, and ideas without saying a word. What's remarkable about the fashion of the 60s is not just how it marked a break from the past, but how it continues to influence us today. Many of the styles that seemed so radical at the time have now become timeless, woven into the fabric of our everyday wardrobes. The mini skirt, for instance, has never disappeared from fashion. It's come and gone in cycles, but it always finds its way back into the spotlight, a reminder of the cultural moment that created it. Similarly, patterns like paisley, polka dots, and stripes have remained staples in fashion, influencing everything from streetwear to high fashion. The shift towards more casual, comfortable clothing, which gained prominence in the 60s, has also remained a central part of fashion today. What was once seen as daring, the notion that clothing could be both comfortable and stylish, is now standard. The power of 1960s fashion wasn't just in its ability to change the way we dress, it also changed the way we think about clothing. Before the 60s, fashion was largely about fitting into pre-established norms. The clothes people wore were often dictated by tradition, by what was expected of them, and by social conventions. But in the 1960s, clothing became a personal choice, a declaration of individuality. It was about finding a way to represent who you were, how you felt, and what you believed in, without needing permission from anyone else. And this shift has had a lasting impact. Today, fashion remains one of the most powerful ways to express personal identity, whether through the clothes we wear or the brands we support. But the influence of 1960s fashion didn't stop there. It was also a key factor in shaping the future of fashion industries, from the rise of street style to the democratization of fashion through mass media. The rise of youth culture and the idea of the teenager as a distinct social group in the 1960s also led to a fashion industry that was more attuned to the desires of a younger, more diverse market. This transformation laid the groundwork for what would later become a global, fast-moving fashion industry, where trends could be created, spread, and consumed faster than ever before. The designers of the 60s, like Mary Quant, Yves Saint Laurent, and Pierre Cardin, were at the forefront of this revolution. They didn't just create new styles, they created a new framework for how we view fashion. Quant's designs, for example, didn't just introduce new cuts and styles, they introduced the idea that fashion could be accessible to everyone, not just the elite. The democratization of fashion became a key theme that carried forward into the 70s, 80s, and beyond. It's no longer about just looking good, it's about feeling good, about being able to walk into a store and find something that expresses who you are, regardless of your social status. And yet, despite all the changes the 60s brought, the most significant legacy might be the simple idea that fashion can be an act of rebellion, a way to push back against the forces that try to define us. The 1960s proved that clothing could do more than just cover the body. It could carry meaning, convey messages, and spark revolutions. And perhaps that's why, decades later, we still look back at the fashion of the 60s with such admiration. It wasn't just about the clothes, it was about the freedom, the possibility, and the refusal to be held back by outdated norms. Looking at today's fashion landscape, it's clear that the spirit of the 60s still influences us. Designers, artists, and everyday people continue to draw inspiration from that era's boldness, its creativity, and its unwavering commitment to individuality. The fashion revolution of the 60s may have started as a response to a particular cultural moment, but its legacy is one that continues to shape our clothing choices, our self-expression, and our ideas about what it means to be free. In a sense, the 1960s didn't just change fashion for a time, it changed how we understand fashion forever. The 1960s weren't just a decade of sartorial experimentation, they were a reflection of the seismic shifts taking place in society. Fashion in the 1960s was not just about looking different or being daring. It was about standing in direct contrast to the established order and questioning everything from gender roles to political systems. What people wore became a means of commenting on the world around them, and clothing became a powerful vehicle for personal and social expression. In many ways, the fashion of the 60s served as a mirror, reflecting the deep cultural, political, and social transformations that defined the era. The civil rights movement, for instance, found its own voice in fashion. African Americans, long marginalized in both society and fashion, began to embrace their heritage and assert their identity through clothing. The Afro hairstyle became a powerful symbol of pride and defiance against the Eurocentric standards of beauty that had long been imposed on Black people. Similarly, the adoption of bold, colorful patterns, traditional African textiles, and designs in the fashion of the time was an expression of a reclaiming of cultural identity. The fashion choices of this time were not just about style, they were about heritage, about power, and about making a statement that could not be ignored. Fashion also became an outward sign of the growing feminist movement. Women were no longer content with being confined to the traditional roles of the past, and this shift was evident in the way they dressed. The rise of pantsuits, the introduction of more practical and comfortable clothing, and the wearing of the mini skirt were all acts of rebellion against the rigid gender expectations that had defined women's fashion for centuries. Women were taking control of how they were portrayed in society, and clothing was one of the most visible ways to communicate their newfound independence. The battle for equal rights was fought in the courtroom, in the streets, and in the way women chose to dress. With every skirt hem that rose, every pant leg that was worn, women were rejecting the idea that their worth or their place in society was defined by the clothes they wore. The youth counterculture movement also played a significant role in shaping fashion as a tool for social commentary. The hippie movement, with its emphasis on peace, love, and free expression, brought a new sense of authenticity and nonconformity to the fashion world. The flowing garments, bell-bottoms, and tie-dye shirts worn by hippies were more than just a rejection of the formal, buttoned-up styles of the past. They were a rejection of the values that the older generation represented. They were a statement that said, "We don't accept the world as it is. We want something different." The bohemian style that emerged from this movement was about finding beauty in imperfection, embracing individualism, and rejecting consumerism in favor of a more spiritual and grounded way of living. The Vietnam War also had its influence on fashion. As the war raged on, more and more young people took to the streets in protest. Their clothing became a part of the protest itself. T-shirts with political slogans, peace symbols, and anti-war messages printed on them became ubiquitous. Fashion was not just about making a statement anymore. It was about making a difference. The rise of the hippie chic look was intertwined with the larger political and social movements that were demanding change. The clothing became a badge of honor for those who stood against the war and fought for a more peaceful world. It was a way to show solidarity with the causes they believed in, to wear their convictions on their sleeves, literally. Looking at the 1960s in retrospect, it's clear that fashion was never just about the clothes. It was about the values those clothes represented. Fashion in the 60s was a symbol of resistance, a way of challenging the status quo, and a means of forging a new path. The clothes people wore were an extension of their beliefs, their desires, and their dreams. They were a way to tell the world, this is who we are, this is what we stand for. Fashion became a movement in itself, one that was just as powerful as the political, social, and cultural revolutions that were unfolding across the globe. The legacy of this time is still felt today. The political and cultural movements of the 60s may have been specific to their time, but the power of fashion as a tool for social change remains as relevant as ever. Whether it's the use of fashion in modern-day protests, the rise of political fashion statements on the runway, or the continued fight for gender equality and racial justice, clothing continues to serve as a means of self-expression and resistance. What we wear is never just about fabric and design. It's about what we stand for, who we are, and the world we want to create. Fashion, as seen in the 1960s, has the power to shape culture, challenge norms, and ultimately change the world. Looking back on the 1960s, it's easy to see the revolution that took place in fashion. But what made it so impactful wasn't the noise it made at the time. It was the subtle, quiet ways that it changed how we think about clothing, identity, and personal freedom. The revolution of the 60s wasn't loud or aggressive. It was a soft and steady wave that gently reshaped the very fabric of society. At the time, people were just beginning to realize that clothing wasn't simply a way to cover the body. It was a way to express oneself, to define a sense of individuality, and to reflect a broader cultural shift. What seemed radical then is now accepted as part of our everyday world. In many ways, the 60s ushered in a new age of personal freedom in fashion. People weren't just dressing according to societal expectations anymore. They were dressing for themselves, choosing clothes that felt right, that expressed their own personalities and ideas. Fashion became a means of self-discovery, a way to define one's identity beyond the confines of what had come before. For women, this shift was especially significant. Gone were the days when women had to wear dresses that were modest and restrictive. The miniskirt, pants, and more relaxed silhouettes symbolized a new era where women were free to dress how they wanted and to express themselves without apology. But it wasn't just the liberation of women that made the fashion revolution of the 60s so profound. Men, too, began to break free from the rigid, traditional clothing that had defined masculinity for so long. The suit, once seen as the pinnacle of sophistication and the mark of adulthood, was now being reinterpreted. Men began to experiment with bold patterns, colors, and cuts, embracing a more youthful, carefree look that matched the energy of the decade. The Beatles, for example, made the suit a symbol of modernity, while at the same time rejecting the staid, corporate look of their father's generation. Men's fashion became more expressive, less about conformity, and more about individuality. It was no longer enough to look proper. Men now wanted to feel free to dress in a way that reflected their personal identity. The quiet revolution of the 60s was also a rebellion against the consumerism that had come to define the post-war world. The hippie movement, with its emphasis on simplicity, natural materials, and handmade items, rejected the fast-paced, mass-produced world that was emerging in the 50s. The focus was on authenticity, sustainability, and personal expression. Clothes weren't just products to be bought. They were a reflection of one's values. Wearing something that was secondhand, handmade, or unique wasn't a matter of inconvenience. It was a statement of rebellion against the growing culture of overconsumption. This shift toward more sustainable and meaningful fashion choices would later become a central issue in the modern fashion industry, as the impact of fast fashion continues to be debated today. The impact of the 1960s fashion revolution goes far beyond just what we wore. It changed how we viewed ourselves and our place in the world. Clothes were no longer just for dressing up. They were for dressing into who we were. It was about feeling something deeper, about choosing to wear clothes that resonated with your inner self, rather than simply meeting social expectations. Fashion became a powerful tool for self-expression, a quiet but powerful way to communicate who we were, what we stood for, and what we believed in. Today, the legacy of that revolution is still with us. The clothing choices that seemed so radical in the 1960s, the miniskirt, the trousers for women, the bold prints and colors, are still staples in modern fashion. But their significance is much more than just style. They are a reminder of a time when fashion was a statement of freedom, individuality, and rebellion against the status quo. They remind us that fashion has the power to change more than just the way we look. It can change the way we think, the way we live, and the way we see ourselves. In the end, the revolution of the 60s wasn't just about the clothes. It was about creating a new way of thinking, a new way of being, and a new way of living in the world. Fashion became a medium through which people could express their hopes, dreams, and desires. It wasn't just about what was on the surface. It was about what was beneath, about the deeper meanings that clothing could carry. The quiet revolution of the 60s was one that changed the world, not by shouting, but by quietly and gently shifting the fabric of society, piece by piece. It was a revolution that still echoes in the clothes we wear today, reminding us that fashion is never just about what we wear. It's about who we are and who we want to be.